It was 4:17 a.m., too quiet to be real, when the lights around a Russian refinery flickered, stuttered, and then vanished, as if the war had learned where the switch was. For months, the world watched tanks grind forward and trenches fill with mud, assuming this war would be decided by steel and numbers. But somewhere above the clouds, Ukraine made a colder calculation. Wars are not won by the loudest explosions. They're won by what keeps the engines running after the noise fades. Fuel, power, money. Without those, even the largest army becomes a statue. Impressive, immobile, doomed. So Ukraine stopped chasing the fist and went for the bloodstream. At first, the strikes seemed scattered. A depot here, a refinery there. Russian officials waved them away as debris, accidents, isolated incidents. But patterns don't lie. Night after night, drones slipped past defenses not to terrorize civilians, but to map, probe, and puncture the same category of targets. Oil refineries that fed military convoys, storage tanks that fueled aircraft, energy nodes that financed everything from missiles to manpower. This wasn't chaos. It was an algorithm. Every drop of fuel burned was a kilometer not driven. Every refinery shut down was a battalion slowed. Every blackout was a reminder that war isn't just fought at the front. It's sustained in the background by pipelines, pumps, and profit margins. Russia's war machine runs on energy like blood through veins. Oil sales bankroll recruitment. Fuel keeps armor alive. Power keeps factories humming. Ukraine understood that destroying tanks was expensive and slow. Disrupting energy was cheaper, smarter, and devastatingly efficient. A drone costing thousands could erase infrastructure worth millions. A 10-second impact could undo years of construction. Shockwave economics. As the strikes escalated, so did the silence afterward. Refineries went offline for maintenance. Exports quietly dipped. Fuel shortages rippled through supply chains. Repairs began, then stopped, then restarted, never fully catching up. Because when hits come every few days, stabilization becomes a fantasy. It's not about total destruction. It's about permanent instability. That's the turning point most people miss. Ukraine wasn't trying to burn Russia to the ground. It was trying to keep it off balance forever. Force Russia to spend money repairing instead of advancing. Force logistics officers to reroute instead of resupply. Force commanders to choose which units get fuel and which don't move at all. Strategy over spectacle. Foresight over firepower. Think about the math. One side invests billions to extract, refine, transport, and protect energy. The other side invests a fraction to interrupt that flow at the weakest points. Which equation wins over time? Which pressure breaks first? The attacker pushing forward, or the system holding them up? As refineries burned, the consequences bled outward. Armored units became cautious, then rare. Mechanized assaults slowed. Infantry advanced on foot, exposed, undersupplied. Logistics officers scrambled as timelines collapsed. When fuel becomes scarce, everything else follows. Morale, coordination, momentum. Dominance doesn't disappear in one blast. It erodes, quietly, relentlessly. And there was another layer to it, one far more dangerous than flames. Every strike carried a message, not just to generals, but to civilians living hundreds of kilometers from the front. The war they were told was distant, now hummed overhead. Drones buzzed in the dark. Explosions lit the horizon. Facilities once considered untouchable burned on camera phones. The idea of safety, of depth, of insulation, ruptured. Energy infrastructure isn't just economic, it's psychological. It's the promise that life will continue uninterrupted. When that promise cracks, doubt seeps in, confidence drains. Questions start forming in places propaganda can't easily reach. If the lights can go out here, what else isn't under control? Ukraine understood that too. This campaign wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about choice architecture, forcing Russia to constantly react, forcing leaders to explain why the engines stalled, forcing a nation built on the image of strength to confront fragility in real time. The battlefield expanded from trenches to transformer stations, from front lines to financial spreadsheets. And the lesson beneath it all was simple and unsettling. In modern war, mass is vulnerable. Complexity is fragile. Systems collapse faster than armies. You don't need to defeat everything, just the things everything depends on. So the drones kept coming. Not louder, not bigger, just smarter. Each strike another reminder that dominance today isn't about how hard you hit, but how precisely you choose where. The war shifted from brute force to brainpower, from attrition to disruption. A paradigm shift written in fire. And as the smoke rose and repairs began again, one question lingered in the darkness, unanswered, waiting for the next night to fall. If energy is the backbone of war, what happens when Ukraine decides to reach even deeper into the system?
The sirens wailed in a city that was never supposed to hear them, and in that moment, Russia's greatest advantage, distance, collapsed into silence and fire. At first, these deep strikes felt impossible. The map said Ukraine couldn't reach this far. The defenses said nothing would get through. The narrative said Russia's rear was untouchable. Then the drones arrived anyway. Not in ones or twos, but in waves, threading through darkness with machine calm, slipping past radar like questions no one had prepared to answer. Krasnodar Krai lit up. Rostov felt the shockwave. Saratov heard explosions echo across the river. And near strategic air bases, places designed to project power outward, something unthinkable happened. Power came inward. The war knocked on Russia's own doors. This wasn't luck. It was escalation by design. Ukraine's drone campaign didn't just grow longer in range, it grew smarter. Each strike taught the next one where to go, where not to go, and how defenses reacted under pressure. Air defense systems fired, revealed themselves, and became data points. Routes were adjusted. Altitudes tweaked. Decoys sent ahead like ghosts. Precision replaced brute force, and suddenly the impossible became repeatable. Russia insisted it was winning every exchange. 94 drones destroyed, 100 intercepted, 0 damage. That was the official line. But the night sky told a different story. Fireballs don't come from debris. Refineries don't burn for hours because of shrapnel. Power grids don't fail on schedule by accident. Eyewitness videos flooded out before statements could. Shaky phone footage, orange horizons, air defense guns barking too late, explosions timed seconds apart, like punctuation in a sentence already written. The evidence wasn't polished. That's why it was devastating. Reality doesn't need press releases. The escalation wasn't about numbers alone. It was about geography. Ukraine didn't just strike deeper, it struck wider. Multiple regions in a single night. Multiple targets with different military roles. Refineries, depots, ports, airfields. The message was unmistakable. This is no longer a localized threat. This is systemic. Every additional kilometer shattered an assumption. That distance equals safety. That size equals security. That air defenses guarantee control. Ukraine didn't overpower these beliefs. It bypassed them. Strategy over force. Mind over mass. And then came the turning point. The moment the narrative cracked. Because when strikes happen once, they're incidents. When they happen twice, they're warnings. When they happen again and again across regions, against protected targets, they become proof. Proof that perfection is required from defense, while offense needs only probability. Proof that interception rates don't matter if even a few drones get through. Think about the asymmetry. A defender must stop everything. An attacker needs only one success, one fire, one explosion, one video shared before sunrise. Dominance isn't about stopping all threats. It's about controlling perception, and that control was slipping. Russian citizens began waking to unfamiliar sounds. The war, they were told, was far away now, hovered overhead. The deep rear was no longer deep. Safe zones blurred. The front expanded into the imagination. Fear doesn't need constant explosions. It needs uncertainty. And uncertainty spread faster than drones ever could.
For Ukraine, this escalation served a higher logic. These strikes forced Russia to stretch its defenses thin, protect everything, and therefore protect nothing well. Air defense units were redeployed, coverage gaps appeared, costs rose, fatigue set in. Every additional night of alert drained attention and morale. This wasn't escalation for spectacle. It was escalation as leverage. The lesson underneath it all was brutally modern. In a world of precision systems and information leaks, depth is fragile, size is loud, complexity is vulnerable. The side that adapts faster, not the one that shouts louder, controls the tempo, and tempo decides outcomes. Ukraine didn't need to dominate the skies. It only needed to visit them often enough to make certainty impossible, to make planning expensive, to make lies harder to maintain. Each deep strike wasn't just an attack. It was a question thrown into the dark. How many more can you stop? And as defenses strained and explanations grew thinner, the drones kept coming. Not recklessly, not randomly, but deliberately, as if counting down towards something larger. Because if Ukraine can reach this far, this often, with this level of precision, the real question isn't where the next strike will land. It's what happens when escalation meets saturation, and whether anyone is truly ready for what comes after.
A refinery went dark, and with it, thousands of engines silently lost the ability to move, fight, or return home. This is where the war changes shape. Not with a single explosion, but with a ripple. One strike doesn't just burn fuel, it fractures an entire system that depends on timing, flow, and confidence. Ukraine understood this early. If you want to slow an army, don't chase its soldiers, starve its machines. Every refinery Ukraine targets processes millions of tons of crude each year. That number sounds abstract until you translate it into tanks refueled, aircraft launched, trucks resupplied, and units rotated. When those facilities are hit, production doesn't just pause, it stumbles. Repairs take weeks. Parts are scarce. Skilled labor is stretched thin, and before one site fully recovers, another is struck. The result isn't collapse. It's something worse. Permanent imbalance. Fuel production drops. Storage tanks burn. Export routes tighten. Suddenly, a country built on energy revenue starts rationing its own output. Domestic shortages emerge. Gasoline exports are banned. Profits shrink. Corporate giants report losses where there were once surpluses. The math stops working. And war is nothing if not math. Russia's military runs on logistics like a clock runs on gears. Fuel is the largest gear. When it slips, everything else grinds. Armored units wait for resupply that arrives late, or not at all. Mechanized assaults are postponed, then cancelled. Training schedules compress. Rotations stall. Commanders are forced to make choices no doctrine prepares them for. Which units move and which stay still. This is where the battlefield begins to tilt. Because when fuel is abundant, armor leads. When fuel is scarce, infantry walks. And walking soldiers are slower, more exposed, and more vulnerable. Vehicles that once dominated terrain become parked assets, silent and useless. Artillery fires less frequently. Air support hesitates. Momentum evaporates. Ukraine didn't need to destroy Russia's entire refining capacity. It only needed to reduce it enough to force trade-offs, enough to turn strength into hesitation, enough to make every kilometer an argument. The escalation followed a brutal rhythm. Strike, fire, repair, strike again. Each hit reset the clock. Each repair effort drained money and attention. Refineries that should have stabilized instead existed in a constant state of emergency. Temporary fixes replaced long-term solutions. Maintenance crews worked under pressure, knowing another strike could come before dawn. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And the economic consequences mirrored the military ones. Energy companies reported falling profits. Revenue streams narrowed. Capital that should have gone toward modernization or expansion was rerouted into damage control. The war economy began consuming itself,
spending more to stand still than to advance. Dominance is expensive. Instability is ruinous. As fuel shortages tightened, logistics officers scrambled. Supply routes were rerouted hundreds of kilometers. Convoys took longer paths. Bottlenecks formed. Delays compounded. What once took hours took days. What once was routine became unpredictable. And unpredictability is lethal in war. Casualties began to rise, not because of a single tactical failure, but because of systemic exhaustion. Units went into combat undersupplied. Evacuations slowed. Reinforcements arrived late. The difference between survival and loss narrowed to minutes and meters. This is the quiet violence of economic warfare. No dramatic charge, no cinematic breakthrough, just pressure. Constant, relentless, invisible until it isn't. Strategy replacing spectacle, foresight replacing firepower, a paradigm shift where destroying less achieves more. The turning point wasn't marked by a headline, it was marked by behavior, more foot patrols, fewer armored thrusts, shorter advances, longer pauses. The battlefield didn't freeze, it stiffened, and stiff systems snap. Ukraine proves something uncomfortable for modern militaries. You can have numbers, you can have weapons, you can even have territory, but without fuel, none of it moves, and without movement, war becomes attrition against yourself. Think about the imbalance. Billions invested in extraction, refining, storage, protection. Thousands spent on a drone that interrupts it all. One side bleeds money to maintain complexity. The other exploits that complexity with precision. Strategy over force. Mind over mass. And as refineries smoldered and depots emptied, the war entered a new phase. One measured not in kilometers gained, but in barrels lost. Not in tanks destroyed, but in tanks unable to start. The machine kept running, but slower, louder, less certain. Because once fuel becomes a question mark, every plan becomes conditional. And as Ukraine continues to tighten that equation, one unresolved question hangs in the air, heavier than smoke. If logistics decide wars, what happens when the pressure shifts from disruption to collapse?
When a fire lit the horizon outside a quiet Russian city, and for the first time, the war felt close enough to breathe. Not on a screen, not in a briefing, outside the window. For years, the Kremlin sold distance as safety. The front was far away. The fighting was controlled. Life at home would remain untouched. Then the explosions started appearing on phones before officials could explain them away. Burning depots, damaged refineries, military facilities glowing orange in the dark. The narrative didn't collapse all at once. It cracked, slowly, visibly, irreversibly. Ukraine understood something most wars ignore. Fear doesn't require occupation, it requires presence. And presence can be delivered by a drone in the middle of the night. At first, people told themselves it was isolated, an accident, debris, air defense doing its job. But videos kept coming. Different cities, different regions, same sound. The distant whine, the sudden flash. The shockwave that rattled windows and certainty at the same time. The war had crossed an invisible line. It had entered the living room. Social media did what state television couldn't stop. Clips spread faster than statements. Shaky footage carried more weight than polished denials. When people see fires with their own eyes, trust becomes optional. Skepticism takes root, and once doubt exists, it multiplies. The Kremlin responded with numbers. Drones intercepted, threats neutralized, control maintained. But control is not something you announce, it's something people feel. And what they felt instead was uncertainty. What if the next one is closer? What if this isn't the last? What if safety was never guaranteed at all? That question is more powerful than any weapon. Psychological pressure doesn't arrive like a bomb. It accumulates, it settles into routines. Sleep gets lighter. Sirens feel louder. Every unfamiliar sound becomes a test.
People begin checking the sky instead of the news. Anxiety becomes background noise. And the data started to reflect it. Antidepressant usage climbed, quietly, steadily, not as protest, but as coping. A society under strain doesn't always shout. Sometimes it medicates. Sometimes it withdraws. Sometimes it answers surveys differently. Support for peace talks edged upward, not because people suddenly loved compromise, but because endurance has limits. Endurance erodes when the cost becomes personal, when the war stops being a concept and starts being an experience. Ukraine's strikes didn't need to convince everyone. They only needed to unsettle enough to force conversations behind closed doors, enough to make official optimism sound rehearsed, enough to create a gap between what people were told and what they were seeing. That gap is dangerous for any government, especially one built on the image of absolute control. The escalation was subtle, almost elegant. No grand announcements, no claims of psychological warfare, just consistency, just repetition. Just proof that the rear was no longer immune, that the idea of a safe Russia was an illusion maintained by distance and silence had been broken. This is where the real pressure formed, not from destruction, but from contradiction. When reality contradicts authority often enough, authority weakens without being challenged directly. People stop arguing, they stop believing. And belief is the currency of power. The turning point wasn't when fear peaked, it was when fear normalized, when burning facilities became expected, when each new video was shocking, but not surprising. That's when strain becomes structural. That's when morale doesn't just dip, it settles lower and stays there. Ukraine paired economic damage with psychological friction. Fuel shortages slowed armies. Anxiety slowed societies. Together, they created a feedback loop. Less fuel meant fewer victories. Fewer victories meant more questions. More questions meant more doubt. And doubt is contagious. This wasn't about forcing surrender through terror. It was about exhausting confidence, about proving that control is fragile, about showing that modern power isn't just measured in territory, but in perception. Strategy over force. Mind over mass. Ukraine didn't need to march on cities to affect them. It only needed to visit their nights, to remind people that wars don't stay where leaders say they will, that promises have expiration dates, that distance is a privilege, not a guarantee. And as economic strain deepened and psychological weight settled in, the war entered its quietest and most dangerous phase, the one where pressure builds without headlines, where decisions are shaped by fatigue rather than fury. Because when a society starts asking how long instead of how strong, the outcome begins to shift. And the final question now lingers, unresolved, echoing across cities that once felt untouched. How much pressure can a system absorb before the demand for control gives way to the desire for change?